The year was 1863, and the town of Cedar Grove carried a silence that was almost unnatural for its size. It was a place tucked between rolling fields and thick woods, where the roads turned to dirt and the seasons carved themselves into the land more sharply than anywhere else. The Civil War had pulled the country apart, but Cedar Grove seemed untouched, as if it had been forgotten. Yet behind the white fences and gardens that bloomed in orderly rows, something heavy lingered in the air, like a shadow nobody wanted to name. The Hendersons lived in a large house just outside town, their gardens stretching wide with roses, lilies, and neat stone paths that wound in careful lines. To anyone passing, it looked like a place of pride, a home built on hard work and wealth. The family name carried weight in Cedar Grove. They were seen as refined, polite, and even charitable when eyes were on them. But beneath that polish, there was something colder, something that showed in the way voices lowered when their carriage rolled by. The heart of it all was the garden itself. To neighbors, it was a marvel. Rows of flowers kept alive even in dry summers, fruit trees bending under their own weight, and a hedge trimmed so carefully it looked like a wall of greenstone. To the Hendersons, the garden was their mark of power. No matter the hardship in town, no matter the whispers of shortages and war, their garden thrived, a place where time seemed to stop. Children from Cedar Grove sometimes pressed their faces against the iron gates, staring at it with a longing they couldn't explain. Inside the house, life followed a strict rhythm. The family had rules for everything, from how meals were eaten to how one must walk across the polished floors without scuffing the wood. It was an ordered world, one where control showed itself in the smallest of gestures, a glance that silenced, a hand tightened when questions strayed too far. To outsiders, the Hendersons' lives seemed enviable, even perfect. To those within, it was a different story. The man of the house carried himself with an authority that made others lower their eyes. He had a way of speaking that left no room for doubt, no space for refusal. His wealth had been earned through land and deals that townsfolk never fully understood, but it kept the Hendersons in a place above others. His wife stood beside him with a quiet presence, her hands always busy with small tasks, her voice gentle yet careful, as if every word might be judged before it left her mouth. They had a way of appearing united, but silence hung between them when no one else was around, a silence that spoke more than words ever could. The children of the town often wandered near the Hendersons' property, drawn by curiosity and the lure of beauty they had never seen inside their own homes. But they were warned not to linger, not to test the patience of those who own the land. Some listened, some didn't. There was a strange pull about the place, as if the ground itself wanted company, wanted voices to echo across the neatly lined beds of flowers. Life in Cedar Grove was simple on the surface. Farmers woke before the sun, women tended to their homes, and children ran wild through the fields when chores were done. Yet there was always the war, waiting like a shadow, just beyond the edge of every conversation. Brothers gone, fathers missing, letters delivered with black seals. It made people cling tighter to what stability they had, and for many, that meant turning a blind eye to things they didn't want to question. In a time when survival depended on routine, no one wanted to disturb what little peace they had still. Unease crept in. Stories began to spread in hushed tones, carried from porch to porch. Small things at first. Children who had last been seen playing near the Hendersons' hedge, voices at night that didn't belong to the family, soil freshly turned where no new plants had been placed. Nothing was ever said directly, because the Hendersons were not people you accused. But people remembered, and in their remembering, suspicion grew roots. In the daylight, the Hendersons' garden looked harmless, even beautiful, a jewel that set their home apart. But in the dusk, when the light bent low and shadows stretched long across the earth, the rows of flowers seemed less inviting. The air grew thicker, the silence heavier. It was as if the ground held secrets it would never willingly share. And yet, children kept wandering back, drawn to something they could not name. The family carried on as though nothing had changed. The man's stern walk, the woman's quiet smile, the gates locked tight each night. The house itself was spotless, as if order and beauty could hold back anything dark that pressed against the edges. But no matter how much the family polished their image, cracks showed. Servants whispered of things buried beneath that neat soil, of nights when screams were swallowed by the thick hedges, of laughter tea had stopped too suddenly to be natural. The IT was a time and place where appearances meant survival. Neighbors kept their distance, convincing themselves there was nothing wrong, that no one was missing, that children simply wandered too far into the woods and lost their way. But deep down they knew. They saw the way the Hendersons' garden never faltered, how its beauty seemed to feed on something more than sunlight and rain. And so, Cedar Grove remained still. The townsfolk pretended not to notice. The Hendersons continued their rituals, and the garden grew, lush and untouchable, a silent witness to what lay beneath. What looked like a paradise from the road was, in truth, a place where innocence vanished and never returned. IT would be years before the truth pushed its way through the soil, demanding to be seen. But even then, the story of the Hendersons' garden was more than a tale of loss. It was a story of power, of silence, and of the way beauty can hide, wrought if no one dares to look closely enough. The seeds of tragedy had already been planted, and the ground was waiting. The Henderson home, for all its perfect walls and polished furniture, had begun to carry an undercurrent that could no longer be ignored. The garden still bloomed, more vibrant than ever, yet the air around it felt charged, like a storm waiting to break. What once seemed like whispers from townsfolk now echoed louder, their unease fueled not only by what they saw but by what they chose to turn away from. Inside, the man of the house grew restless. He had always been a figure of control, but now his temper sharpened, his words cutting in ways they hadn't before. The war, though miles away, was reaching him in ways he could not control. Markets shifted, crops failed in neighboring farms, and men who owed him debts no longer had the means to repay. His wealth remained, but it was thinner than it had ever been. This loss of control seeped into everything, into the way he spoke at the dinner table, into how he looked at his wife when she faltered, and into the garden, which he guarded with almost feverish intensity. His wife, though quiet, carried her own storms within. She had been raised to obey, to move with grace and silence. But years of living under his shadow had carved deep lines in her spirit. She watched the garden grow, knowing it was no natural miracle. She tended to the flowers with shaking hands, not out of joy, but out of fear. There were moments when she lingered too long near the roses, her lips moving as if whispering apologies to something unseen beneath the soil. The servants noticed, though none dared to speak of it. Children continued to vanish, not in large numbers at once, but slowly, in ways that gave room for excuses. One boy disappeared after wandering out to collect firewood. A girl was last seen chasing a stray dog that slipped beyond the Hendersons' hedge. Each time, the town searched the woods, the creeks, even the roads leading out. Each time, nothing was found. And each time, eyes turned toward the Hendersons' garden. But no one spoke aloud what they feared, that IT wasn't just the missing children that fed the unease. Strange sounds filled the nights. Servants whispered of laughter echoing through the halls when the family was asleep, of doors closing on their own, of footsteps pacing the garden lawn after midnight. One maid, pale and trembling, swore she had seen small hands pressed against the inside of the soil, as though something buried tried to claw its way out. She left the house by morning, refusing to ever return. The man dismissed these fears as foolishness, but his behavior betrayed him. He patrolled the garden at night with a lantern, his steps heavy, his eyes darting to the flower beds. Neighbors passing late on the road saw the glow of his light weaving between the hedges, circling again and again like a predator guarding prey. The garden was no longer a place of beauty. It was a fortress, and he was its warden. But there were cracks forming, even within the family. His wife's silence turned into something sharper, looks that lingered too long, small rebellions that were barely noticeable but dangerous in their meaning. A forgotten task, a refusal to answer immediately, a tremor in her voice when she did. He noticed. He always noticed. His grip tightened, his control more absolute. But in her eyes, there was a flicker of something that had not been there before. Not defiance, but dread so deep it turned into quiet resistance. And then came the debts. Though wealthy, the man had made promises during years of plenty that now returned to demand payment. Old deals with other landowners, favors owed, even bribes offered to officials, all began to surface. The war had made everything uncertain, and he was no longer untouchable. Whispers of his financial strain reached town, and though no one dared laugh openly, the thought of the mighty Hendersons crumbling filled many with secret satisfaction. To him, it was humiliation. Every coin lost was a wound. Every whisper of doubt was an insult that burned. The garden became his answer to everything. He poured himself into it, his obsession turning feverish. Each new planting seemed less about beauty and more about proving something, as if the earth itself could be forced to show loyalty. He demanded his wife spend more hours tending the flowers, demanded the servants keep the soil perfect, and demanded silence when questions arose. The more control he lost in the world outside, the tighter he clutched the ground within his gates. But beneath the soil, the truth pressed upward. Rainstorms made the earth softer, and sometimes bones, small and pale, shifted dangerously close to the surface. Servants were sent to cover them quickly, to press the dirt back down and place new flowers above. It was not enough. The ground itself seemed unwilling to hide forever. His wife carried the weight of it like a sickness. She could not sleep. Her nights were filled with visions of the children who had once laughed beyond the hedge. She saw their faces in the shadows, heard their voices in the wind. Sometimes she stood at the upstairs window, watching the garden, her breath fogging the glass, as though she were waiting for the earth to open and reveal everything. She had married into power, but now it chained her to horror. The town's patience thinned. Mothers held their children tighter, and fathers muttered about leaving Cedar Grove altogether. Yet no one confronted the Hendersons directly. The family's influence was still strong, their reach long. To accuse them without proof was to risk ruin, and in a time when survival was fragile, no one dared risk it. So the silence continued, heavy and poisonous, feeding the Hendersons' power even as it rotted them from within. There were moments when the mask almost slipped. Once, during Sunday service, a child's shoe was found near the Hendersons' gate. It was small, mud-caked, and clearly belonged. ING to one of the missing. The town grew restless, but the man dismissed it with a sharp laugh, suggesting children often wandered and left things behind. His tone was so sure, so commanding, that even in the face of evidence, the crowd lowered its eyes. But the doubt did not fade. It grew, like weeds beneath a perfect rose. The wife, meanwhile, had her own secret. She kept a small book hidden in her sewing box, its pages filled with careful handwriting. In it, she wrote what she could not say aloud. Names of the children, dates they vanished, her guilt bleeding into ink. To her, it was confession, a way to keep her soul from shattering entirely. To him, it would have been betrayal. Had he found it, her fate would have been sealed. The breaking point came slowly, like cracks spreading across glass. His temper grew violent behind closed doors, his wife's fear deeper, the servants fewer. The garden seemed to demand more, as though it hungered, and he obeyed with a desperation that frightened even him. When another child went missing, the town reached its limit. The whispers became louder, no longer hidden behind closed doors. People spoke the family's name with suspicion that could not be silenced. And still, he walked the garden at night, lantern in hand, convinced that as long as he could keep the ground covered, his power remained. His wife stood at the window, staring into the dark, knowing the truth would not stay buried forever. The earth was restless. The town was restless. And the Hendersons' perfect garden was becoming a grave that no amount of roses could disguise. The night the crime unfolded was heavy with rain. The sky had turned black hours earlier, and thunder rolled over Cedar Grove like an angry drum. The garden, usually a place of proud display, looked like a battlefield in the storm, its flowers beaten down by water, its soil turning soft and unsteady. The Hendersons' iron gates rattled in the wind, and the lantern that swung by the front steps flickered like it might go out at any second. It was a night that seemed built for tragedy. Inside the house, tension had been building all day. The man had returned from town with his pride cut deep. Whispers had reached him, people speaking more boldly now, no longer afraid to question him in private. He knew eyes were on his garden, new suspicion clung to his name. Every glance, every hushed voice he passed seemed like an accusation. By evening, his temper was boiling. He stormed through the halls, barking orders at servants, slamming doors, and demanding silence when none was brave enough to speak. His wife stayed at the edges of his anger, her face pale, her body tense, as though expecting his rage to turn on her at any moment. She had lived with his control for years, but something in him had shifted these past months. It was no longer only about power. It was about desperation, fear of losing everything he had built. That fear made him reckless. She saw it in his eyes, in the way he paced the floor with clenched fists, in the way he spoke of the garden, as though it were alive and depended on him to feed it. When the storm hit, it shook the house with every strike of thunder. The servants had gone to their quarters, whispering prayers, leaving only the family awake. That was when the knock came, a sharp, hurried sound at the gate. Through the sheets of rain, a figure stood. A small one, a child, drenched and shivering, was separated from their family while trying to escape the storm. The sight of the Hendersons' large house must have seemed like safety, a place to run for shelter. The man's jaw tightened. His wife gasped softly, already moving to the door, but his hand shot out and caught her wrist. His grip was iron, his eyes burning with something she had seen before, but never so strong. In that moment, she understood. He wasn't thinking of kindness. He was thinking of the soil, of the whispers in town, of the need to make the garden thrive again, to prove his power had not weakened. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm raging inside him, but he opened the door, his voice strangely calm as he called the child in. The little one stepped across the threshold, dripping water onto the polished floor, wide-eyed and grateful to be led inside. The wife's lips trembled, her body frozen between instinct to protect and fear of what was coming. She tried to speak, tried to find words to stop him, but the man's look silenced her. What happened next unfolded with a speed that made it almost surreal. He led the child through the halls, his voice low, reassuring, promising a fire and dry clothes. The wife followed at a distance, every step heavier than the last. They reached the back door, where the garden waited, its soil already wet and loose from the downpour. He told the child they would find safety there, away from the drafty halls. His tone was gentle, but his hand shook as he pushed the door open. The storm swallowed them as they stepped outside. Rain hit their faces like needles, wind whipped against them, and the garden stretched out in darkness, only flashes of lightning giving it form. The wife stood in the doorway, her nightgown clinging to her skin, her breath shallow, her voice caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, but her body betrayed her. The man dropped to his knees in the mud, his hands digging frantically into the earth. The child stood frozen, confused, staring at him. Then he turned, his face twisted with something between madness and fear, and before the child could move, his hands were around their throat. The scream that followed was swallowed by thunder. The wife finally moved, rushing forward, but it was too late. The struggle lasted only moments, but it felt endless. The child kicked, fought, their cries muffled by the storm, their small body no match for his fury. His grip tightened until at last the fight went still. Lightning lit his face, and in that brief flash, the wife saw it clearly. Rage, yes, but also terror, as if even he could not believe what he had done. The body slumped in his arms, lifeless, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. Rain poured over them, mud swallowing the child's limbs, thunder rolling so loud it shook the earth. The wife fell to her knees, her hands trembling as she reached out, her sobs lost to the storm. He said nothing. He only lowered the child into the hole he had dug, his movements mechanical, his breath ragged. Each shovelful of mud that fell over the small body splattered against his clothes, against his wife's hands as she tried weakly to stop him. But he did not stop. He would never stop. When the last of the soil was pressed down, he stood, his chest heaving, his eyes wild. The wife stared at the mound, her heart shattering, her soul heavy with guilt she could not bear. She wanted to SCR, aim into the night, to claw the earth open and free the child, but her voice broke under the weight of silence. He grabbed her arm, pulling her up, his voice sharp and cold. Not a word. He hissed, his face inches from hers, rain streaming between them. Do you understand? Not a word. The aftermath was chaos inside her, though outwardly she obeyed. He returned to the house, shedding his soaked coat, his steps steady as though nothing had happened. She followed, hollow, her eyes fixed on the floor. The house smelled of damp earth and death, though no one else seemed to notice. Servants slept, unaware of what the storm had hidden. She moved like a ghost through the halls, every sound amplified. The drip of rainwater from the ceiling, the creak of the stairs, the pounding of her heart. He poured himself a glass of brandy, his hands trembling only slightly now, convincing himself it had been necessary, that it had been survival, that the garden demanded it. He told himself the child had wandered, that no one would ever connect the storm's chaos to them. But she knew better. She knew the town would feel the absence. She knew the soil could not hold secrets forever. She returned to her small book that night, adding one more name, her tears staining the ink. Her hands shook so badly she could barely write, but she forced the letters onto the page, each stroke of the pen a wound. In the silence after the storm, the garden seemed alive, the earth darker, richer, as though it had fed. The flowers stood straighter in the dawn, their colors brighter against the gray sky. To him, it was proof. To her, it was damnation. The storm passed, but the silence it left behind was worse than the thunder. The garden glistened with water in the pale morning light, the soil darker and heavier where it had been disturbed. To the man, it was a mark of strength, proof that he had once again done what needed to be done. To his wife, it was unbearable. She avoided the windows, unable to look at the garden without feeling her stomach twist. Every time she passed it, she imagined the child's eyes staring back at her through the soil, the cries still echoing beneath the ground. The man carried himself with a new kind of calm in the days that followed. His temper, though sharp, was steadier now, as though he had released something that had been pressing against him. He told himself the garden was his shield, that as long as it flourished, the town's whispers would never grow into accusations. He even walked into Cedar Grove with more confidence, nodding stiffly to neighbors, speaking with his usual authority. But beneath that surface, his hands shook when no one was watching. He drank more than before, late at night, sitting in the dark, whispering to himself as though convincing some invisible jury that he was right. His wife, meanwhile, was unraveling. Sleep abandoned her. Each night, she lay awake, her body tense, her ears straining for sound she prayed she wouldn't hear. Childlike laughter, the patter of small feet on the floorboards, the soft scrape of nails against wood. She saw things in corners, flickers of shadows that vanished when she turned her head. She spoke less, her words thin and fragile when she did. The servants avoided her, unsettled by the hollowness. In her eyes, they began to say she was ill, though no doctor could cure what weighed on her soul. The town, too, felt the change. Another missing child could not be brushed aside, not when it came so soon after the storm. Families searched, calling into the woods until their voices cracked. Fathers gathered in the tavern, muttering darkly, their suspicion no longer hidden. Mothers clutched their children tighter, forbidding them from stepping near the Hendersons' gates. The family's reputation, once untouchable, was now stained. People still bowed their heads when the Hendersons passed, but it was no longer respect. It was fear, mingled with hate, the whispers grew bolder. Some said the Hendersons had struck a deal with the devil to keep their garden alive. Others swore they had seen small figures moving behind the hedges at night, their faces pale and blurred, their laughter too hollow to be human. Whether these were true sightings or the fevered imaginings of frightened minds didn't matter. The legend of the Henderson garden was born, and with each passing day, it rooted itself deeper in the town's collective fear. Inside the house, the wife carried the heaviest burden, her small book filled with names and dates. Each entry a confession she could not speak aloud. She knew her husband would destroy her if he ever found it, but she also knew she could not bear the weight of silence alone. The guilt pressed against her chest like a stone, making it hard to breathe. She wanted to run, to tell someone, anyone, but the grip of fear was stronger. She was trapped in a prison built of wealth, reputation, and secrets buried beneath roses. The servants began to leave, one by one. Some claimed family emergencies. Others simply vanished without explanation. Those who remained did, so only because they had no choice, their fear outweighing their options. They avoided the garden as much as they could, whispering prayers when forced to work near it. One young maid finally broke, running into town with wild eyes, swearing she had heard crying coming from beneath the soil. She was dismissed as hysterical, yet her words fed the fire of rumor already spreading. The man ignored it all. He doubled down on his routines, hosting dinners for select guests, offering wine and polite conversation as if nothing were wrong. But even those who accepted his invitations noticed the cracks, his wife's shaking hands as she poured their drinks, the way his eyes darted toward the windows when the wind picked up, the faint smell of damp earth that seemed to cling to the house no matter how often it was cleaned. The community's fear soon turned into quiet anger. Families demanded answers, though none dared confront the Hendersons directly. Instead, they began to distance themselves. Invitations stopped coming. Farmers refused to trade with him unless necessary. The church pew the Hendersons once occupied with pride sat empty more often than not. To lose one's place in the eyes of Cedar Grove was not just social. It was survival. And though the man tried to mask it, he felt the sting of rejection deep in his pride. His wife suffered differently. The guilt hollowed her from the inside, leaving her frail, her face pale, her hair losing its shine. She began to speak to herself openly, whispering names as if calling out to the children buried beneath the garden. The servants who overheard avoided her, unsettled by her growing madness. To her husband, she became a liability, a crack in the wall he had built around their secrets. He threatened her, his words sharp, his hand raised more than once. Still, she kept writing in her book, her one act of defiance, her only way of clinging to what little humanity she had left. The town's unease eventually reached the ears of officials. The sheriff, a man weary from years of war and loss, came quietly one morning, asking questions. The man welcomed him with forced hospitality, offering him brandy, leading him on a tour of the house. The sheriff asked about the storm, about the missing child, about the garden. Each answer was firm, confident, and delivered with the authority of a man used to being obeyed. But the sheriff's eyes lingered on the garden, on the soil that looked freshly turned despite the rain. Nothing came of that visit, not then. The sheriff had no proof, only suspicion. But the town noticed. They saw the sheriff's carriage outside the Henderson home, and when he left with a grim expression, the whispers grew louder. The Hendersons were no longer a family to admire. They were a family to fear. For the man, this shift only deepened his obsession. The garden had to remain untouched, untouchable. He patrolled it more fiercely, worked its soil with his own hands, as if daring anyone to question him. For his wife, it was unbearable. She saw the townsfolk turn away from her on the road, saw mothers pull their children close when she passed, saw pity in the eyes of those who once envied her. Shame consumed her, though it was not her crime. She carried the guilt anyway, unable to shed it, unable to confess. The aftermath of that stormy night rippled through Cedar Grove like poison in a well. Families grew colder, tighter, suspicious of every shadow. Children were no longer allowed to wander freely, their laughter muted by fear. And in the heart of it all, the Hendersons' garden thrived, bright, beautiful, and terrible, a place where the flowers bloomed more vividly than anywhere else, fed by secrets that refused to stay buried forever. The trial was the stage upon which each character's arc found its resolution. For the perpetrator, the verdict of guilt was inevitable given the overwhelming evidence, but came not as a moment of self-awareness but of stubborn denial. Even as the sentence was read, they clung to fragments of justification, unable or unwilling to see their actions for what they truly were. The years of imprisonment ahead promised punishment but not redemption. The psychological prison of their own conscience would remain an even harsher sentence. For the victim's family, justice was bittersweet. They had fought tirelessly for the truth to be recognized. Zed, for the voice of their loved one not to be drowned out by lies or sensationalist narratives. Yet when justice arrived, it carried no joy, only the heavy recognition that no sentence could bring their child back. Some family members found strength in activism, determined to prevent others from suffering similar fates. Others retreated into private grief, unable to face a world that had so brutally stripped them of what mattered most. Their transformation was stark. Once ordinary people living quiet lives, they had become unwilling symbols of resilience and loss. The supporting figures in this tragedy, too, faced their reckonings. Friends and bystanders who had once ignored warning signs found themselves haunted by guilt. They replayed conversations, moments of hesitation, times when they chose silence instead of confrontation. While they were not held legally accountable, the burden of moral complicity weighed heavily on them. Their arcs ended not in courtrooms, but in sleepless nights and fractured relationships, proof that the shadows of crime reach far beyond the immediate circle of victim and perpetrator. Was justice truly served? On paper, yes. The guilty were punished, the system functioned, and the narrative of law and order was upheld. But in the private lives of those touched by the crime, justice was a hollow word. It offered accountability, but not healing. It closed the case, but did not mend the jagged scars left behind. The crime, once an isolated act of violence, became a public spectacle that forced society to confront uncomfortable truths. Media outlets dissected every detail, often blurring the line between information and entertainment. The story spread rapidly, amplified by social media outrage, each platform shaping the narrative to suit its audience. Some painted the perpetrator as a monster beyond comprehension, while others sought to humanize them, suggesting that systemic failures or personal trauma played a role. In both cases, nuance was lost, and the tragedy became content. The community where the crime occurred bore its own wounds. Once seen as safe and unremarkable, it was now branded by association, the crime becoming part of its identity. Neighbors locked their doors earlier, parents grew suspicious of strangers, and institutions scrambled to rebuild trust. Schools introduced new protocols, community groups held town halls, and the once ordinary streets became sites of whispered cautionary tales. Beyond the local impact, the case ignited national debates about justice, accountability, and prevention. Were there enough safeguards in place to protect the vulnerable? Had institutions ignored early warning signs because of pride, bureaucracy, or sheer indifference? Politicians, activists, and commentators seized upon the tragedy, turning it into a rallying cry for reform. While some genuine change was implemented, policy reviews, funding for support services, others simply used the case to score points, highlighting society's tendency to exploit trag. Eddie for gain. At its core, the crime revealed fractures in the social fabric. The dangers of unchecked obsession, the blind spots in communities that pride themselves on respectability, and the ease with which manipulation can thrive in silence. It was not just one person's failure, but a collective one, exposing how ordinary pressures and overlooked red flags can culminate in extraordinary violence. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of the crime lies in what it reveals about human behavior. At every stage of the story, morality was tested, and too often found wanting. The perpetrator's choices, driven by jealousy and control, showed how love twisted into obsession can become indistinguishable from violence. Friends who looked away demonstrated how silence can become complicity. Even the public, consuming the story with fascination, displayed the paradox of a society that condemns violence while feeding off its spectacle. Power dynamics were central to the tragedy. In relationships, the imbalance of control, emotional, financial, or social, created conditions where abuse could flourish unnoticed. The perpetrator wielded influence not only over the victim, but also over how others perceive them, exploiting charm and respectability as shields. This imbalance of power, left unchecked, became a silent accelerant of violence. At the same time, the story complicates our understanding of morality. None of the choices leading to the crime were made in a vacuum. Each stemmed from recognizable human emotions: fear of abandonment, desire for control, shame, pride. These are not alien forces, but familiar impulses, which makes the crime all the more chilling. It reminds us that the capacity for darkness exists in everyone, waiting only for the right mix of pressure and silence to surface. In the end, the case becomes less about monsters and more about mirrors. It forces us to confront how fragile morality can be when tested, how quickly love can curdle into possession, and how easily silence can serve as an accomplice. The story concludes not with triumph, but with acknowledgement of pain endured, of lessons learned, and of the limits of justice. The crime will never be undone. The victim will never return. What remains is the responsibility of those left behind, families, communities, and society at large, to decide what meaning can be drawn from the tragedy. Some will choose activism, transforming grief into a catalyst for reform. Others will choose silence, carrying scars privately, unwilling to let their pain become public property. And for society, the challenge remains to remember without sensationalizing, to reform without exploiting, and to recognize the warning signs before they calcify into catastrophe. The conclusion of this crime story is therefore not an ending, but a reflection. It invites us to look inward as much as outward, to see in its details the patterns that shape human behavior everywhere. It asks us to wrestle with justice not just as a legal outcome, but as an ongoing responsibility, one measured not by verdicts, but by the choices we make to protect, to speak, and to care. In this way, the story lingers. It becomes more than a tragedy. It becomes a reminder that beneath the surface of everyday life lie the complexities of human nature, capable of both tenderness and cruelty, of silence and courage, of destruction and redemption.